Welcome. Thank you for being here. It is a real honor for me to introduce a truly distinguished American, Jeffrey Rosen. My name is Justin Collings. I serve as BYU's academic vice president, and there aren't a whole lot of perks about being the academic vice president, but one of them is that sometimes when you want something to happen, you can make it happen. So earlier this year, I was reading this remarkable book, The Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. And I was about 50 pages in, and I thought, this is amazing. We need to get this man on our campus. And so I texted Paul Edwards at the Wheatley Institute and said, get this guy on campus. And here he is. So, and I'm delighted to have him here. Jeff Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. The National Constitution Center is the only institution established by Congress on a nonpartisan basis to promote understanding of the U.S. Constitution among the American people. And I can't think of a worthier goal and mission for any institution. If you've not been to the National Constitution Center, you need to find the next opportunity to get to Philadelphia and go there. One of the sweetest experiences of my life was taking my 3 teenage daughters through a room there where they've got bronze statues of all of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention, and I walked them around, and I said, this is Gouverneur Morris, and this is what he did and said and thought, and here's James Madison, and walked them all the way around. There are some liabilities of having a father who's a constitutional law professor, and this is one of them. But it's truly remarkable in connection with his role at the NCC. He is the host of the podcast We the People, which I think is maybe the best podcast in America. They bring in the best thinkers, and it's really not just supremely informative and illuminating about constitutional issues, both historical and present day, but is such a model of the civic dialogue that has eroded, unfortunately, in our country. And Jeff is the wizard who makes that happen, bringing together people of various persuasions and drawing out their best thinking and putting them in dialogue with one another. It's truly a beautiful thing. In addition to his work at the National Constitution Center, Jeff Rosen is a professor of law at George Washington, and has a really distinguished career as a writer with the best venues in the country, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the New Republic. He's the author of several really distinguished books about some of the great figures of our constitutional history, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Louis Brandeis, Chief Justice and President William Howard Taft, and various other topics. And you can start with me to count the days down to publication now. He's just finished a manuscript about Hamilton and Jefferson, the rivalry that defined America. That, like this, is one of those books, when I hear about it, I just think, I got to get my hands on that book. This was a book after my own heart. I'm married to a classicist, and I'm a constitutionalist, and this book brings together those in such a wonderful way. And the last thing I want to say is this is a book that's really aligned with our strategic objectives as a university and with our mission and aims. One of our strategic areas of emphasis is constitutional government. And the aims of a BYU education is we aspire to provide an education, as you know, that's spiritually strengthening, intellectually enlarging, character building, and leading to lifelong learning and service. And this is a remarkable contribution to our national effort to build character and to focus the pursuit of happiness on the cultivation of virtue. Many years ago, I worked with a professor from Germany and a former Supreme Court justice there named Dieter Grimm. And he once did an extended interview. It was kind of a form of autobiography. And one of his interlocutors said, well, you've always been a friend of public broadcasting, as we see in your judicial decisions. And he shot right back. He said, I am a friend of the Constitution. and that includes its protections for public broadcasting. And I think as much as anybody in America, Jeff Rosen deserves the title of a friend of the Constitution and our constitutional republic. And so I hope you'll join me in giving a warm BYU welcome to Jeff Rosen.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction, and what an honor it is to be at this great university with your emphasis on character development through lifelong learning. And you so inspiringly recited the National Constitution's mission statement. We feel at the Constitution Center that we work at constitutional heaven, and I'm feeling here that I am in constitutional heaven. The prayer was so beautiful, too, in calling on the divine spirit that guides our own spiritual lives and also the democratic health of the nation, correctly noting the crucial connection between personal self-government and political self-government. And what I want to talk to you about today is how I came to understand that connection by reading the books on Thomas Jefferson's reading list. How I came for the first time to see that for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by long-term virtue, they meant just what you've aspired to pursue in your mission statement, namely self-improvement, character improvement, self-mastery, and lifelong learning. Really, if you had to sum up the classical understanding of virtue in a single sentence, it would be self-improvement through lifelong learning. So I'll tell you how I came to that revelation, because it was nothing short of a revelation. It changed my life. It changed the way I thought of myself about how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen and how to think about the founding. And then let's talk together about ways that we can together take this great mission across this campus, across the state, and across America. So here's how the whole thing happened. It was a series of unexpected synchronicities that led me to this completely unusual COVID-era reading project. I noticed that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had chosen as their mottos for the pursuit of happiness a book by Cicero I'd never heard of called The Tusculan Disputations. And Franklin used it to illustrate a project where he set out in his 20s to achieve moral perfection. And he did this by making a list of 12 virtues. Some of you may have seen it in his autobiography. Industry, temperance, prudence, cleanliness, order. He saves the one he finds hardest for last, and that's humility. And he makes a chart, and he puts the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis. And every week he resolves to focus on a different virtue and to put an X mark in the box where he's fallen short. He tries this for a while. He finds it's incredibly depressing because there's so many X marks, and he gives it up after a while, but he feels like he's a better person for having tried. I knew about the project, but I didn't know this book by Cicero that Franklin used to illustrate it, where he says, without virtue, happiness cannot be. A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville on the beautiful UVA campus, and in the hotel room was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters, and they look a lot like Franklin's. Silence, when angry, count to 10. When very angry, 100. Resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. But again, what I didn't know is that Jefferson also, when he was asked for the secret of happiness when he was old, would send an excerpt from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. And it was a little longer than Franklin's, and Jefferson had copied it out in his commonplace book when his dad died to console himself when he was only 14 years old. And the excerpt said, "He who has achieved tranquility of soul, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the wise man of whom we are in quest. He's the happy man." So I thought, okay, I got to read Cicero's Tusculan Disputations because it was very important to both Franklin and Jefferson for their definition of happiness as virtue. But what else to read? Then I found this golden reading list, which Jefferson would send out when he was old to kids who were going to law school, to his adult friends who were trying to build a private library, and he revised it over the years. You can find it on Founders Online in his letter to Robert Skipwith, and I've become an evangelist for the transformative power of primary texts, so check it out and read the full list yourself. What struck me about the list was both the scope of the books on it and also the rigorous schedule that Jefferson prescribes. First, the scope. It includes moral philosophy and literature and politics and ancient history and science and astronomy and poetry. What caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy that Jefferson sometimes called natural ethics or religion. And at the top of this list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then Cicero's On Duties, and then Seneca's letters, and Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, and then Enlightenment philosophers like Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Bolingbroke, and Hume. What struck me about the list is that I'd never read any of the books on it, and I've had a marvelous liberal arts education, and I am grateful every day for the teachers, some of whom we shared, others I had in high school. They're with me each day, and I give thanks for these great inspirations that taught me to devote my life to learning about history, political philosophy, English. I was an English major in college, for which I'm so grateful, and law. But I'd never read these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum when I was in college in the 80s. And in the 80s, I remember yearning for this kind of guidance about how to lead a good life. It was the greed is good decade, bonfire of the vanities, you do you, and I was looking for an alternative to the hedonism and materialism that were celebrated by pop culture. And what I didn't realize, because this great wisdom was hiding in plain sight and had fallen out of the curriculum, is that this is exactly the question that the classical moral philosophers had set out to answer. So I thought, I got to read these books. But then I was really inspired by Jefferson's schedule. He says you got to get up every morning before sunrise, read the moral philosophy for 2 hours while the mind is fresh, then sunrise, then political philosophy and history before lunch, then after lunch, science and astronomy, then dinner, then light Shakespeare and poetry for light entertainment, and then to bed 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no breaks. So I really don't know what got into me, but it was COVID, and I don't know what I was thinking. So I followed the schedule. So I got up every morning, I read for about 2 hours, watched the sunrise, then I found myself writing these sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I'd read, which seems incredibly weird in retrospect. And I'd not written sonnets before, and again, I don't know exactly what it was, except later I found that all sorts of people in the founding era wrote sonnets after reading this moral philosophy, including the great Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet. Alexander Hamilton wrote some sonnets. Mercy Otis Warren, the poetical genius of the Revolution, who Adams praised. And then John Quincy Adams would wake up in the White House, read his favorite book, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, write really inspiring sonnets of abolitionism, and then get on with his day. So there's something in the air. But that's what I did, and I did this for a year, and what I learned changed my life. It changed my understanding of how to be a good person and a good citizen. And what I learned from the moral philosophy is that for the ancients and for the Enlightenment sources, happiness meant the pursuit of long-term virtue rather than short-term pleasure. But by virtue, they meant something particular that's not intuitive. They meant self-mastery and character improvement and self-improvement. Understanding Aristotle's famous definition of eudaimonia was a start. Eudaimonia, good spirit. Aristotle defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, but excellence and virtue aren't self-defining, so I didn't really understand that until I realized it's really about emotional modulation and moderation. Aristotle in the Ethics has a chart, the golden mean, and there are a series of passions or emotions, and for each passion there is an excess or a deficiency, and you're supposed to seek the golden mean, not rashness or insensibility, but temperance. And the classical virtues are temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. And it's not about avoiding emotion, but about avoiding unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, so we can achieve that calm tranquility and self-mastery that allows us to be our best self, to serve others, and align with the divine harmonies of the universe. Much of this moral psychology comes from Pythagoras, of all people. Who knew? I didn't. That in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, if that weren't enough, Pythagoras was also a guru who lived on the Isle of Croton, and he encouraged his disciples to first be good and then be like gods. And the way to achieve that kind of divine self-mastery is rigorous moderation in eating and drinking. He's a big vegetarian, with one exception, no beans. He's very stringent about how you can't touch beans. And there's a famous story about his disciples are being chased by the enemy, and they come to a bean field, and they'd rather die than trample on the bean field. So the enemy general comes up and says, "I'll spare your life, just tell me one thing. Why on earth won't you eat beans?" And the Pythagorean soldiers said, "We'd rather die than tell you," and they spit out their tongues and perish on the bean field. So no beans under any circumstances. But with that exception, he's a vegetarian. And in addition to his moderation in eating and drinking, it was Pythagoras who comes up with the idea that the soul is composed of certain faculties or powers: reason in the head, passion in the heart, and desire in the stomach. And each night we should make a system of moral self-accounting to ensure that we're using our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and desires so that we're achieving that calm tranquility. Plato popularizes Pythagoras' division into his famous metaphor of the charioteer, representing reason with two horses. One is noble and the other is appetitive, and his goal is to keep them all pulling in the same direction. And this idea of faculty psychology is central to the moral education of the founders, and more than half receive education in this moral psychology, either at university or in their reading of the kind of books that I was reading on Jefferson's reading list. The modern way that I have the easiest time understanding it is with the Stanford marshmallow test. Remember in the 70s, some very young kids, like 5 years old, are given a choice. They can have one marshmallow if they want it immediately, and if they can wait for 15 minutes, they get 2 marshmallows. And in the test, the kids who could wait just did better in later life. They did better in school and better in their careers. And it's that ability to resist immediate gratification, to serve your long-term interests and to serve the public good, to subjugate your ego-based emotions like anger and jealousy and fear, that's the task and that's the way. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg told me that her mother gave her this wisdom, which she had read in New York public schools as an immigrant from Ukraine. Avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will distract you from productive work. Be a lady, Justice Ginsburg's mother told her. Be a gentleman was what the founders were told as kids. Self-mastery and self-improvement, always being a lifelong learner, is what allows us to achieve our God-given talents and best to serve others. So that's the core of classical moral philosophy. What was so striking for me, and again, I have to stress how exciting it is now that we're living in an age when all these texts are online and you can do word searches. I did word searches for pursuit of happiness or pursuing happiness in the sources. And what's remarkable is the phrase is everywhere. This isn't some secret meaning. It's in the classical sources. It's in the Enlightenment sources. It's in the Christian sources like Wurlitzen and Tillotson. It's in the Christian educators like Samuel Johnson, who wrote the main moral textbook of the Revolution, which was prescribed by Ben Franklin as the core curriculum for Penn. And it's in the Whig and Civic Republican revolutionary sources that inspired the opposition to Stuart tyranny. So all of these sources use the phrase the pursuit of happiness. All of them define it as a kind of virtuous self-mastery. And the similarities are so much more important than the differences. Of course, there are doctrinal differences among different religious sects and among pre-Christian and Christian traditions and among the traditions of the East and the West. But it's the similarity that's so much more important and also that emphasized and that struck the founders. I was so impressed by what deep readers the founders were. And among the most inspiring moments in all of American letters is the reconciliation between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. I came to understand this in writing about Adams's efforts to subjugate his vanity, because the book, after I read the moral philosophy, set out to ask, well, how did the founders do in living their values and living up to their efforts to lead virtuous lives? And each chapter focuses on a different virtue that the founder worked on and explores what they read and how they fell short or not. So obviously for Adams, it had to be humility, because he's the most famously self-regarding man of his age. You remember from the musical 1776, which if you're haven't seen this in a pre-Hamilton age, check it out. Adams is the one who's always singing, "I'm obnoxious and disliked, that cannot be denied." And people are always noting that he's raging and that he's not getting enough credit for the revolution. He wants the president to be called His Elective Majesty. People make fun of him as His Rotundity, and it's because he's vain. So what does he do when he and Abigail meet for the first time and they're dating? They decide to make a list of each other's faults, which is a really bad dating strategy. But of course they got it from Pythagoras, because they'd read the Golden Virtues, and they said each night before bed you must make a list of all your virtues and vices. So they make their list, and Abigail is really soft pedaling it. She says, well, some might possibly call you vain, but it's really because you're so brilliant that you're intellectually intimidating, she says. And Adams says, well, you're not practicing the piano enough, and you're not reading enough, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she says with great self-possession, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman should not comment on a lady's posture. So they overcome that initial bump, and they go on to have one of the great romantic, intellectual, political, and spiritual friendships and marriages of all of American history. And they are always urging each other to be their best self and to overcome their vanity. And Abigail plays a crucial role in persuading Adams to reconcile with Jefferson. Jefferson and Adams fall out. The election of 1800 is, the Union almost fissured from the outset, and our times now are extremely challenging. Well, they were similarly challenging then, and Hamilton dies in a duel because he's favoring Jefferson over Burr, because he thinks that Burr is a seditious traitor who will bring down the Republic. And the political parties are up and running, and Adams and Jefferson don't talk for about 10 years. Then Abigail sends a lock of her hair as a kind of gesture of friendship, and they reconcile and they start writing together. And what do they want to write most when they're back together for the first time? They want to talk about the books they've read. And it's so moving to see, they're in their 70s and 80s, and they're still reading and learning and growing and writing. But what their trouble is access to books. And what Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras, the great founder of moral philosophy, who he's read closely, may have traveled to the East and read the Bhagavad Gita. And remember I said how incredible it was how they noticed the similarities between the traditions of the East and the West. And Adams notes that the central lesson of the Bhagavad Gita, which is renounce and enjoy, renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal salvation, is very similar to the Stoic dichotomy of control, which says don't focus on trying to control things you can't control, which is everyone else's thoughts and actions and emotions. Focus on the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and actions. And when Adams says, if only we can show that Pythagoras read the Bhagavad Gita, then we'll see that the moral philosophy of both the East and the West can be summed up in what he calls the hymn of Cleanthe, which says, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. But there's just one thing. Adams doesn't know whether Joseph Priestley, who's writing a comparison of Hinduism and Pythagoreanism, has lived long enough to complete his work. And Jefferson says, good news, he lived. I've got the book here in Philadelphia. I'm going to send it to you. And Adams is just so excited that he's going to get access to this book, which he thinks will show the consonance of the wisdom traditions. And you realize today that we are living in a world where all the books in the world are free and online. And you realize what a miraculous time we live in. So it's beautiful to see them talk about that. And then Jefferson counters that at the end of his long life, he's concluded that he's no longer a Stoic, as he was as a kid, but now an Epicurean. But he means by that not wanton hedonism. That's a libel on Epicurus, says Jefferson, by the Stoics. By Epicureanism properly understood, Jefferson means the rational contraction of virtuous desires so that we can meet them. In other words, instead of hungering after luxury and wealth and external events that we can't control, we should try to achieve, we should desire to achieve virtuous self-mastery, and then that's a desire that we can meet. It's just amazing that these great statesmen, these great founders of America, really when they're old, they want to talk about moral philosophy and religion and spirituality and art and literature, and they're just learning and growing until the end, which for them in the end was the pursuit of happiness, virtuous industry on a daily basis, becoming a little bit, learning a bit and becoming a little bit more perfect was the reward of the youthful habits of industry that they developed as kids. So that's their great virtue. Now that leads to their great vice, of course, and that obviously is slavery, and that leads to Jefferson and slavery. And I have to share that on close examination, Jefferson becomes more of a shocking hypocrite, not less, when you look at him by the standards of the other enslavers. It was so striking to see a speech that Patrick Henry gave right after he'd given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, which is a quotation from Addison's Cato, his favorite classical play. And Henry says, outside the Virginia State House, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it," he says. So in other words, he knows it's wicked and immoral and violates the Bible and natural law, but he likes the lifestyle and doesn't want to give it up. And in moments of candor, all of the enslavers of that generation recognized that they had the same hypocrisy. They liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. And no one more, though, than Jefferson, and no one at a more flamboyant scale of hypocrisy than Jefferson, because if Jefferson not only exalts industry and virtuous self-mastery and frugality, but he also insists that no generation can impose its debts on successor generations. The earth lives in usufruct for the living, and the whole point of his political and moral philosophy is the immorality of surviving debts. That's why he wants a constitutional convention every 19 years, so that the people can't bind future generations, and that's why he insists that other generations can't bind each other financially. And yet, he lives at Monticello, not as a Palladian fantasy of an agrarian shepherd, but as a Caligulan emperor. He's a shopaholic. He lives wildly beyond his means. He's always buying French furniture and wine and gratifying his desire for these luxuries. And because he's basically broke and in debt his whole life, that's his justification for why he can't free his own enslaved population, except for his own kids. He promised to come back, he promised to Sally Hemings when she agreed to come back from Paris that he would free their kids on his death, and he kept that promise. He freed 2 of his Hemings kids, having already allowed 2 to escape. There were a handful of other Hemings relatives who were freed, but no one else, and as a result, mothers were separated from their children, and his entire enslaved population had to be sold to pay his crushing debts. It's a shocking blind spot in Jefferson's moral life. And it's one that was not shared to the same degree by other founders, including Washington. Contrast Jefferson with the great Washington, who becomes more self-mastered on close examination, not less. Washington's virtue is his remarkable resolution, obviously, his incredible courage on the battlefield, and his temperance. He has a volcanic temper, but he's never seen to lose it in public, except on a handful of occasions. Once on the battlefield when his orders are disobeyed, and once when the Senate disrespects him and he storms out because he doesn't like liberty is taken with his dignity. But Ron Chernow, his great biographer, thinks he gets this from his mom, who's always nagging him and telling him to do his laundry or whatever, and as a result, he tries to never be seen losing his temper in public. And his greatest moment of self-mastery is when the troops at Newburgh are rebelling in 1784. The Congress won't pay them, they can't get back pay because there's no common taxation system that can be enforced, and they're going to rebel. Washington what does he do? First, he puts on a classical play, which is, again, Addison's Cato, his favorite play, praising the consolations of mild philosophy. And then Washington summons the troops. He stands on this wooden platform called the Temple of Virtue, surrounded with classical tropes, and he appeals to the men for patience and temperance and prudence, the classical virtues, and just says, if you can wait a little longer, then I'll ensure that you get paid. And then he struggles to read his speech, and he takes out his reading glasses. I can take out my reading sunglasses, but no, he puts on his reading glasses and he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep because they've never seen him confess weakness before. And the idea of the great self-composed Washington showing that he's human after all is just overwhelmingly moving. And it's a sign of this great self-mastery. Is the strength of his character that makes him the greatest man of his age and ensures that the Republic and Constitutional Convention succeed because everyone knows that he's going to be the president. In his farewell address, Washington appeals to the people for virtue. And the farewell address is famous for its warning of faction. He says that unless Americans find virtuous self-mastery, will go the way of Greece and Rome, and the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and the red and the white rose in England, and surrender our liberties to cheap luxuries and will be overtaken by a Caesar. And Washington says the solution is self-mastery and civic education. He wants to create a national university so that people can come across the country, set aside their sectional and regional and geographic differences, and learn two things: the study of the principles of the science of politics, and also the habits of civil deliberation, how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to listen to differing points of view so that you can achieve the temperance, prudence, courage, and justice that's necessary for personal and political self-government. And he doesn't know whether the Republic will succeed, but that's going to be the key. And now, with that understanding of the connection between personal and political self-government, I was able to read the Federalist Papers in a totally different light. The Federalist Papers are a manual for public happiness. It's a phrase that Madison and Hamilton use all the time. And Madison comes to Philadelphia. He's been reading about the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. And he's also alarmed by reports of Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where farmers are mobbing the armory and shutting down the courthouses because they can't pay their debts. And Madison says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. There's that reason-passion distinction, but now applied not to the government of the constitution of the soul, but the constitution of the state. Madison defines a faction as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. He wants to design a constitution so that just as we harmonize reason, passion, and desire in the constitutions of our souls, so they're balanced in the state constitution with the executive, legislative, and judiciary mirroring the various faculties and try to achieve that harmony that ensures personal and political self-government. And Madison, too, isn't sure that the experiment will succeed, but he has great hope in a new media technology, namely the broadside press, because this will allow arguments like the Federalist Papers to be spread throughout the land, and people can read them with cheap editions in their coffee houses, and a new class of enlightened journalists and statesmen and politicians that Madison calls the literati, which is a phrase he gets from Condorcet, will help people read these documents, will discuss them with them, will lead civil conversations among the citizens, and reason will slowly diffuse its cooling bomb throughout the land. Well, just to describe Madison's hope in this new media technology and the slow diffusion of public reason is obviously to show you the grave degree to which today we're living in a lot of ways in Madison's nightmare. I mean, it's obvious that the world of Instagram and X or whatever it's called and TikTok is not quite the cool voice of broadside reason. Posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason. The entire business model is enraged to engage. And here's a really important part. Citizens have an incentive, an obligation to take the most extreme, most factionate, most hateful and angry positions in order to stir up their base and win likes. When Adams read in Adam Smith that the human desire to be liked or approved of, to get esteem, is the most basic human impulse, he wanted to make all offices hereditary. He thought that basically people were always seeking approval of others. They'd be pandering and becoming really extreme. And his solution is hereditary offices. That's obviously not going to fly, but he would not have been a fan of Facebook, to put it mildly. And that is a failing not only of our leaders, who have an incentive to pander to the most factionate and mobilized base, but to the citizens who, in forming online mobs and factions and taking the most extreme positions, are not practicing the habits of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice that the founders think the republic must muster, or else we will go the way of every other republic and will degenerate into factions, violence, and the mob. The founders have such a deep understanding of history. There's this amazing letter where John Adams writes to Quincy Adams, "I've just been rereading the history plays of Shakespeare, and it's remarkable how all of English history, from Richard II to Richard III, with all the Henrys in between, is the story of blood and faction and the red rose and the white rose. And the only thing that stands between politics and violence," Adams says, "is constitutional principle. It was when England abandoned the principles of Magna Carta and habeas corpus that factions took over, and he insists that the point of the American Constitution is to temper politics with principle to prevent open violence from resulting." And that's the central lesson of the convention, and it's exemplified by no one more powerfully than John Quincy Adams. And let me just say a word about him. I can't even see the time without my George Washington glasses. I'll say a word about Quincy, and then we'll have our question and answer. Quincy Adams, for me, is the most virtuous of the founders. He lives the ideals more thoroughly than anyone else. He's deeply read in the classics. He reads the Tusculan disputations. He reads the Bible closely when he's in the White House, and he turns to both texts to console himself after the two great tragedies of his life. He loses the re-election for president, and his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. He can't deal with the pressure of being named George Washington Adams and also being constantly exhorted by his dad to be perfect and to live a Christian life. Adams wrote a series of letters to his son, letters from a Christian father, and they're really powerful, but it was a lot of pressure. And the son can't take it, and he kills himself. And Adams is devastated. He doesn't know how he'll find the power to go on. What does he do? He rereads the Bible and rereads Cicero. In the Bible, with his own close reading, he was an incredibly close exegete of the scripture, and he found a passage where Jesus promises to free the captives, and Adams concludes on his own that this means the prophecy of the biblical end of slavery. And that turns him into the greatest abolitionist of his time. And he goes back to Congress, the only president to return as a representative. He denounces the gag rule, which forbids the reading of abolitionist petitions. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He votes against the war for Mexico. He yells, "No!" And then he collapses on a couch in the House, and he's carried to a nearby chamber, and his whispered last words are from Cicero, "I am composed." And remember that Cicero passage that Jefferson sent out to all the kids? The perfectly composed person is he who's achieved tranquility of soul. Adams has spent his whole life preparing for that virtuous life, and he, like Cicero, dies with calm self-possession and composure. It's just extraordinary. This is what I want to leave you with. Adams wrote an amazing speech on the 50th anniversary of the Constitution, the Jubilee of the Constitution. And he's really worried about civil war, and things look then kind of like they do now, and it's not clear if violence will result. He says, like his dad, the one thing that will stand between America and violence is learning about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And he makes it a spiritual imperative, connecting his close reading of the Bible with that of the Declaration and the Constitution. And then Adams quotes the book of Deuteronomy, and he says, survival as a nation will turn on your adherence or not to the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. Take these principles as frontlets between your eyes. Put them above your doorposts. Bind them to your arms and your hands. Whisper them to your children before you sleep. Make them the principles of your political salvation. So that's Adams. That's how important it is to learn about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution so we can achieve self-mastery. That's why it's so important that you're doing this work here at BYU to teach the connection between those principles and the virtue and the success of our republic, and that's why I am so honored to be here.
Wow, that was inspiring, and we've got some questions. We'll get through. I may ask a first question. We have some students that have got 1 o'clock classes, so they're honorably excused. But everybody else, stay put till we're done. I was so inspired reading about John Quincy Adams in this book. He's long been a hero of mine, and on a personal level, when he found comfort in reading Cicero, it called to mind an experience we had 18 years ago. We went off to law school. Almost at the very beginning, we learned that our infant daughter, had some serious health problems, and we took her to the Yale New Haven Hospital, and she needed to have a brain surgery. And the resident who came in to talk to us about us in this traumatic moment, turns out he was from Buffalo, New York, which was my father-in-law's hometown, and his name was Mark Cicero. And my wife had been a classicist, and Cicero was kind of the figure in her undergraduate education, and this was heaven's way of telling us it's going to be okay.
Great.
My question would be, thinking about the students who are here, what can they learn from these principles about the way they live their personal life and the way they engage as citizens? And what would be some takeaways from all of this great study, this rich literature that you've brought together here?
Let me share the biggest takeaway I have, which is that I got back into the habit of daily reading. I'd fallen out of the habit of reading. We all read a lot in school, and then life takes over, and you get distracted, and I was reading for deadlines, but not doing reading for its own sake. And then came along these devices, and I'm so addicted to these darn devices that I just wasn't reading. So just spending a year in that incredibly weird Jeffersonian schedule made me want to spend the morning reading. And I'm not catching the sunrise every morning. I don't want to pretend I'm a virtue monger in terms of always getting up 2 hours before sunrise. But I do have a new rule that I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read. And it's totally changed my life. I can't believe it. It's a very concrete kind of Ben Franklin habit. I wake up every morning, I'm totally addicted, I'm tempted to go start browsing, but I remember my rule, and I swipe left to the Kindle. I do read online, because it's so exciting that all the books are on this device. It just blows my mind. It is amazing. When I was a kid, I went to the Library of Congress in DC, and I was so full of wonder at the thought that all the books in the world were there. They're on these darn devices. All I've got to do is swipe left. So I do that, and I'm just reading a lot more than I did before I didn't develop this habit. I finished that Hamilton Jefferson book as a result, and you learn something new. So that's what I'm an evangelist for it. I know you're students and you've got to read a lot for class, but it's a habit, it's a practice. Jefferson and all those guys and women did it while they were at school. And just, if you can, pick a period. I think the mornings are good, but it could be any time of day. It doesn't have to be 2 hours at all. A half hour, 15 minutes, but just to read, not to browse. Jefferson said, I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better. Tacitus was his favorite author of all, the Roman historian. And browsing blogs or newspapers doesn't count as reading. That's something else. Of course, you've got to be informed and so forth, but that's not reading books. You know what reading books is. So please read.
I had a question from a student majoring in bioinformatics. It says, if you could unilaterally change one thing about today's political environment to align our nation's virtues with the original founding virtues, what would it be?
Citizens would read more. And leaders too, of course, but it's not, ultimately, we've got to keep the republic. There are a lot of structural things to say about the ways that we are diverging from the founders' hopes and the rise of political parties by themselves is not fatal, because after all, Madison and Jefferson presided over the rise of the Democratic, Republican, and Federalist Party. That's the Hamilton-Jefferson story, and they believed that the parties would actually represent the virtuous majority of the people in opposition to the moneyed elite represented by the Hamiltonian Federalists, and the parties during less polarized times have indeed constructively channeled interests, but at times of extreme polarization, and that includes geographic polarization combined with social media, we've had violence. It's really striking how rare violence and insurrection is in American history. Richard Hofstadter has a great classic book on American violence, and he says insurrections against federal power are rare. Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion at the founding, which gave rise to the Constitution, and the Insurrection Act are the first examples. And of course, we saw it during the nullification controversy of Andrew Jackson and the secession that led to the Civil War, the violent response to Reconstruction called Southern Redemption, which Grant tried to put down with federal troops, and more violence in the civil rights movement with resistance to integration. But with those relatively few examples, it hasn't been a constant. So the structural changes to reduce polarization are tough, not clear given this media and geographic landscape that can be easily done. Although Yuval Levin and some others have come up with some thoughtful institutional reforms, including eliminating presidential primaries, which tend to lead to more extreme candidates, and also resurrecting the congressional committee system so that you can't have the leaders shove things through on a party vote, but you actually have to deliberate with the other side.
Yeah, if you're to read two books about the Constitution that have been published recently, the first would be this one, and the second one would be Yuval Levin's book,
Absolutely.
American Covenant. It makes the powerful argument that the Constitution is designed to cultivate the virtues that we need, which leads to I'm going to combine a couple of questions. We have a student asking whether religion is required to foster morality and virtue. Adams has the oft-quoted passage about our republic is designed for a moral and religious people and can't serve for another. And a faculty member who contrasts that with a Madisonian idea that if you design the system right, you can absorb the impact of our worst tendencies. And so the question is, where do you fall on that complex of questions? Does virtue need to precede constitutional government? Can the Constitution survive a lack of virtue, and can virtue survive without religious influence?
Great questions. The Constitution can't survive without virtue. I think everyone agrees on that, and they have various degrees of optimism about whether or not virtue can be achieved on a wide scale, whether people can be educated to achieve the self-mastery that will allow them to deliberate with others and to choose wise and virtuous leaders. Is religion required for virtue? There's a disagreement about this. Tocqueville thought perhaps, but he thought that the spirit of religion would ensure what he called self-mastery properly understood was really the classical understanding of the pursuit of happiness, and he thought that the spirit of religion, as he called it, might be necessary. And of course, the founders themselves have different degrees of observance from the more orthodox Christians, including Washington and Adams and the deist Jefferson. But what really struck me, and I really do want to share this, is that even those who are most skeptical of Orthodox Christianity, Jefferson calling himself an Epicurean, he believes in the divine and the urgent need to align with the divine. Stoicism and Epicureanism are religions, and the pursuit of happiness for classical as well as Christian, as well as Eastern, as well as Jewish, as well as Buddhist sources are all a spiritual quest to align with the divine. So understood in these terms, you might say that the spirit of religion or the spiritual quest generally is the pursuit of happiness and is the framework that most people have pursued it through, but it's completely wrong to say that this requires an established church of any kind, or that you have to embrace any particular religion, or that if you choose not to embrace a religion, you can't live a life of self-mastery through a different lens.
That's wonderful. I'm going to abuse authority here and ask a final question. We've got some great questions I hope people can maybe come up and have a chance to engage with. Before I became a full-time administrator and stopped thinking, I was working on a book about George Washington's Constitution.
Wow.
Kind of a constitutional biography of Washington. And one of the things that moved me the most is Washington writes a letter at the end of the Revolution. And the founders, there's kind of a spectrum of pessimism about human nature. Maybe Adams would be representative, and optimism, and maybe Jefferson's there. But all of them fall in different spots at different points in their lives. But Washington says, somebody had said, I'm worried that we're not going to be able to handle our independence now that we've got it. And Washington writes back and he says, the American people may turn out to be something like a young man who comes prematurely into an inheritance. And he will squander some and live riotously for a time, but eventually settle down. And then he has this line. He says, there is virtue at the bottom, and I think we're going to be okay. And I just wonder how, with the great preparation, how would you comment on that assessment from Washington, that there's virtue at the bottom, and what could we do to bring that virtue to the top?
Well, first, you can write that book. I mean, that's an amazing book, and you've got to do it, and you can tell us how we're going to bring it back. That's a great subject. There must be virtue at the bottom, and it's always been a matter of faith, and success has never been guaranteed. I think the way to muster and convene the virtue at the bottom is around the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. We disagree about so much. We're never going to agree about politics, and it's just not productive to debate about politics. But we can debate about the Constitution. That's the point of the We the People podcast, which brings together people of different perspectives, not for political, but for constitutional debates. It's the point of the great Constitution 101 course that we've just launched at the NCC, including a version with Khan Academy, the great online service provider. It's the vision. We're thinking of creating a new course on the virtues and the founders in character education, and I'd love to work with all of you at BYU to think about doing that. And that's why your work here, and students, you're really fortunate to be going to this great university, which has such a focus on these questions of the founding principles and their relevance to today, by modeling and studying history deeply with all of its complexities. We're not going to shy away in any sense from the messiness and contingency and sometimes violence of history, yet always striving to become more perfect within this framework of debate and contestation about the American idea. It's ultimately an inspiring story. And by moving past the current passions of partisan politics, digging in deep about history and modeling being lifelong learners, I think together we can do a lot of good.
Well, Jeff Rosen, for inspiring us all and for a lifetime of service to the Constitution, and for blessing us with this great book and the ongoing work of the National Constitution Center, we offer our deep thanks.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.